Dara was a loving husband, a doting father, and a devoted son, all those things that are of historical interest. But as a ruler of men in troubled times, he must have been a failure. Long continued prosperity had unnerved his character and made him incapable of planning wisely, daring boldly, and achieving strenuously, or if need were, of wresting victory from the jaws of defeat by desperate effort or heroic endurance. The darling of the court was utterly out of his element in the camp. The center of a circle of flattering nobles and ministers knew not how to make a number of generals will obey one's masterly will and act in harmony and concert. Military organization and tactical combination were beyond his power, beyond Dara's power. And he had never learned by practice how to guide the varying tides of a battle with the coolness and judgment of a true general. This novice in the art of war was destined to meet a practiced veteran as his rival for the throne, which he did. I welcome all of you to this particular talk, which we have titled Dara Shikoh from the perspective of public leadership. So I will start the presentation. Let me give you a brief outline of what can be expected in this talk. We will start with a brief introduction of Dara Shikoh, and then we will talk about two distinct paradigms of looking at somebody from the perspective of public leadership. We will also see how we can apply the knowledge of public leadership paradigms on evaluating somebody's historical role. And in this case, we will be looking at Dara Shikoh's role in the particular history of the Indian subcontinent. We will see the perils or dangers of a lingering question of the sort of what if. It goes like, what if Dara Shikoh would have been the Mughal emperor instead of somebody like Aurangzeb? So we'll look at that also towards the end of this discussion. And finally, we will share the sources, the historiography on Dara Shikoh, for which, or rather upon which I have depended for this presentation. So the kind of questions that we will be raising and engage with in this talk are like these. What sort of a leader was Dara Shikoh? And what kind of emotional reactions did he evoke in people's minds, including the people in his court, in the imperial court, the nobility, members of the nobility, army, and also common subjects like peasants. We will also try to analyze his decision-making abilities through certain historical examples. And we will look at his military achievements, the extent of his military skills, his skills as a commander of an army. We will see how he used to react to emergencies and adverse situations. These are the basic questions through which we will try to evaluate his role as a public leader, as somebody who was being trained and groomed to become the emperor of Mughal India. So, as I said, we will start with this brief introduction to Dara Shikoh. Here you can see on your screen the full portrait of Dara Shikoh. So, Muhammad Dara Shikoh Hanafi Kadiri. This is how he introduced himself in a particular work that he composed called Safinatul Awliya. This was basically a collection of lives and works of different Sufi saints. Dara Shikoh was the eldest son, as I'm sure many of you will know, of Shah Jahan and Mumtaz Mahal, and he was born in the year 1650, according to the Gregorian calendar. He was the heir designate or the heir apparent to the Mughal throne. He was chosen by the emperor himself the Emperor Shah Jahan wished Dara Shikoh to take up the reign of the empire after him. And another interesting fact about Dara Shikoh is that the name Dara Shikoh, which means majestic as Darius, the pre-Islamic famed Persian king. This name was given to the eldest son of Shah Jahan or Khurram by Jahangir himself. Dara Shikoh as a child and as a young boy had experienced hardship as a young prince prior to the period when his father, Khurram, who became Shah Jahan, before Shah Jahan ascended the throne. He had been incarcerated, he had been thrown into prison along with his brothers in the war of succession that followed Jahangir's death. And later, when thrown, the father had lavishly treated his eldest son, and through that sort of favor that he gained. I was talking about the particular period in Dara Shikoh's life where Dara Shikoh, as a young man, had been very lavishly treated by his father, the Emperor Shah Jahan. And by the generous favors shown to him by his father, Dara Shikoh ended up gaining and exercising tremendous influence without earning the power or the exercise or the influence that he actually used to have among the nobility in the court. Dara was a patron of Sufi saints. He himself was initiated in the Qadiri order, and he was also uh, predisposed to the arts and scholarship. And he himself composed quite a few works which were about mysticism, theology, and also poetry. He was a man of letters himself. Tara died at the unripe age of 44, murdered by Aurangzeb's men when he was imprisoned. So we will look at public leadership paradigms. There are two distinct paradigms that we will talk about here. Firstly, the Western paradigm, which is heavily influenced by the views of Machiavelli, who wrote Il Principe or The Prince. They talk about how to gain, retain, and power. And you have to also keep in mind that when Machiavelli wrote this particular treatise, he wrote it for a very limited audience. The audience that he had in mind are the nobility in his country. But when we talk about something like a Western paradigm for public leadership, it is by no means something that is a uniform body of thought. It is basically a collection of different perspectives, but they have a distinct character of Western scholarship on them. And in very recent times, this particular field of scholarship, leadership studies, has emerged, and some distinct views have come up through them. Psychologists have heavily dwelt on this particular subject because they have done characterological analysis of different individuals, especially charismatic leaders who have succeeded or failed in their endeavors of leading a country or an organization, etc. And through this, a few things have come to us. I've tried to present here a distilled version of those things and prominent views on public leadership from the Western paradigm. So clarity of vision, planning part, and destination where one wants to reach or arrive at the goal, and dynamic action that is associated with it. So how a movement will lead one towards that goal. These are the basic things These are the criteria, you can say, through which a person, an individual, or sometimes even an organization that leads other organizations or a network of organizations are judged or analyzed in terms of their leadership quotient. The Western paradigm, mainly through its psychological analysis, has come to dwell heavily on the ability of an individual or an organization to build motivational narratives. So, a person or an organization which can build an effective narrative that motivates others who participate in the game called leadership, if I can use that term, uh, has more chances of becoming successful in that game. So, if you can motivate others through the narrative of your goal, of the endeavor that you have undertaken, then you are considered to be a successful leader according to this paradigm. And there is another very specific and distinct school of thought within the Western paradigm of public leadership, which talks about leadership as an emergent phenomenon. So it describes leadership as a phenomenon which arises through the interactions between leader, the followers, and the context in which they meet each other and in which they interact with each other. So these give us useful tools to look at somebody like a historical personality, for example, Darashiko, who we will be looking at today, to evaluate their worth, their role as a public leader. Because Darashiko was chosen by his father, Emperor Shah Jahan, to be the ruler of Hindustan, the emperor of Mughal India after himself. So it is only pertinent for us to ask the kind of questions that we have shared at the beginning of this talk. Chief of which is how good a leader was Darashiko. Parallel to this, we also have the Rajadharma paradigm, uh, which you can call a distinctly Indic paradigm. And this particular way of looking at the concept of public leadership or rulership or kingship is based on something called Danda Niti. It was a distinct Shastra, most prominently found in Arthashastra, the only extant text, only extant major text on Danda Niti Shastra in our times. The other texts which remain, which have come to us, which have sustained the ravages of time, are basically commentaries on Kautya's Arthashastra, like the Kamandakya Niti Sara, which is a commentary on Arthashastra. But the fact of the matter is that the Rajadharma paradigm is based on the Danda Niti Shastra, which talked about how to acquire, maintain, and extend territories. And there's a false notion, among us that Arthashastra is something that talks about how to increase wealth and prosperity. Uh, you know, it also does those things, but its chief goal, its core, is not those things. They might come as a sort of corollary to the main goal that Danda Niti or Arthashastra pursues, which is the ways to acquire, maintain, and extend one's territories, for an administrator or a ruler. And as you can see from the very name Rajadharma, it is a concept which is based on the idea of dharma. And this can be understood, the Rajadharma paradigm of looking at public leadership or evaluating a leader can be very well understood if you look at this beautiful and succinct definition of dharma given by Rabindranath Tagore in his essay Brahman. Tagore says, and I quote, when duty is placed on a foundation of dharma, way above the petty self interests and instincts, one finds room for respite and spiritual gains, even in war. The prevailing general notions about Darashiko are that he was a champion of religious syncretism. He tried to bring Islam and Hinduism at a meeting point. He is also hailed as a multifaceted poet. He is described as a saintly prince and also a tragic character from the Mughal dynasty, who had a vision of India that people say is still relevant in our times. He might be all of those things, but the questions that we are concerned with in this particular exercise, in this talk, um, or are concerned with his role as a public leader, as a ruler, as an administrator. So the things that we will consider in trying to evaluate his role as a public leader are as follows. Uh, you know, these are the things that you have to keep in your mind when you are thinking about Dara Shikoh as a leader, as a ruler or administrator. Firstly, Dara was a constant, Dara's presence with the Emperor Shah Jahan was almost constant. He never left the emperor's side. It was only once when he was sent to Kandahar that he had left the emperor's side. But other than that, he had always remained by the side of Emperor Shah Jahan. So this is the first thing that you have to keep in mind. Secondly, Dara saw a very distinct growth in his influence in the imperial court, and this was also thanks to the favors of the emperor. He was exceedingly fond of his eldest son, and he gave him high ranks. He gave him, an unprecedented income and a command of as many as 50,000 horses, which was unprecedented in his time. So Dara saw his influence growing. Dara had a lot of leisure time at his disposal, and so he could focus on theological and mystical matters. He was predisposed to them. He had a distinct interest in them, and these are evident from his writings and translations, or rather the translations that he commissioned through Hindu pandits and people who knew both Sanskrit and Persian. He himself was quite a polyglot. He knew Persian, Hindi, and also a little bit of Sanskrit. Finally, the thing that you should keep in mind in undertaking this sort of a task of evaluating Dara Shikoh as a public leader is the final years of Dara's life, and also in a way the final years of Shah Jahan's life. The onset of the war of succession between the four brothers, Dara, Shuja, Murad, and Aurangzeb. And this war really started when in 1657, the later part of 1657, Emperor Shah Jahan fell ill. He fell seriously ill, and a crisis arose at the capital. And Dara started to behave in a peculiar manner, which we will, look at length in the later part of this talk. So these are the four things that you must keep in mind, in terms of the periods which are important, and also the aspects which are important to come to a meaningful analysis of Dara Shikoh as a public leader. Dara Shikoh's role can be understood in many ways. We can look at him as a governor of provinces. We can look at him or evaluate him as a commander of armies, because you should keep in mind that all the Mughal princes, and even the princes who are the sons of, or rather the grandsons of the emperor, are trained from a very young age to be leaders of vast armies. So they are expected to become generals, commanders of armies, and they are sent away to distant provinces, sometimes even beyond the borders of the territories of Mughal India, to take care of certain troubles, such as invasion, or even provinces which are situated far away from the capital, where people have mutinied, or there is a rebellion going on. So people are trying to get away from the canopy of the Mughal rule. In such scenarios, the Mughal princes were sent either as governors or as commanders of armies, or as both, to take care of those troubles. So we can also evaluate Dara Shiko's role as a public leader if we try to look at him as a commander of armies. The third thing is to look at his influence, the kind of influence that he exerted upon the nobility and even the officers of the army, and also theologians who were present at the court. So the important thing to remember here is that in the special scenario of the Mughal court at the time of Shah Jahan, Dara Shikoh was second only to the emperor in terms of influence at that court. Dara Shikoh can also be looked at from the perspective of how good a son he was to his father. He can be evaluated as a husband and as a father variously. The things that we are mainly concerned with are the three factors on the left side of the screen. So as Dara Shikoh as a governor of provinces, as a commander of armies, and what kind of influence he exercised upon the people at the court. So we will look at Dara at the Mughal court. The first thing that you have to consider here is that there is no concept of primogeniture among the Mughals. So primogeniture is the idea which dictates that the firstborn male child will become the heir of the throne for a dynasty. That sort of concept was absent among the Mughals. So the accession to the throne was inevitably determined by bloody feuds, bloody conflicts. And whoever was the fittest to survive that sort of a bloody conflict would become the king, would become the emperor. And Dara, this was a wise move by Dara, we can say. He followed in the footsteps of his grandfather and great-grandfather, Jahangir and Akbar, respectively. And he displayed characteristics of asceticism and piety following them. And through these, Dara tried to build his image, really. He was trying to get legitimacy as a divine sovereign, which had by Dara's time, or rather even by Shah Jahan's time, become a very, very important notion of kingship for the Mughals. Now, contrary to the popular idea of our times, Dara was by no means a liberal, neither was he a promoter of interfaith harmony as we understand these concepts or these terms, liberal and interfaith harmony, these two terms. The way we understand these concepts today, Dara was neither of them. Dara was not a liberal person. He did not advocate liberalism, and he did not promote interfaith harmony the way some champion of interfaith harmony would practice the concept today in our times. And like some other Muslim individuals of his own era, Dara was intrigued by Hinduism, and he had the leisure, of course. He was not as busy as his other, three brothers, and also not his father, Shah Jahan, when he was a young man. He had to busy himself with the work of the governor of provinces, and he also led many campaigns. He got involved in the War of Succession, which kept him busy. So, unlike many other Mughal princes, Dara had the scope, the time to indulge in matters of theology and mysticism and satisfy his intrigues regarding Hinduism. And this is a very important thing. Dara Shikoh never renounced Islam when he was engaging with Hindu yogis or sannyasis, when he was when he had commissioned Vedanta, the Upanishads, to be translated into Persian. He engaged with the ideas that were contained in the Vedanta, but he never renounced his faith in Islam. He was a professed Muslim, a Sufi Muslim, and he always introduced himself as a Hanafi, which is a very prominent Sunni Muslim sect, most prominently present in the Indian subcontinent. And also, he presented himself as a disciple of the Qadiri sect of the Sufis. Dara had been seeking to arrive at a universal font of Tawhid. Tawhid is the Islamic concept of monotheism. Okay, the concept of monotheism is present in different religions of the world, but most specifically, it is the Islamic concept of monotheism or Tawhid, which Dara was trying to find out in other religions. And he wanted to promote the idea of this monotheism, this very distinctly Islamic concept of monotheism or Tawhid, among the learned people. And his hope was that if learned people had, come to respect this concept of Tawhid, then other people, the commoners, will also in time follow it. And it was mainly with this goal that he was trying to find out the reflection of the Islamic concept of monotheism or Tawhid in the other religions. And he was by no means unique. He was not the only person in doing this exercise or undertaking this endeavor. There were other people who were trying to do the same thing. One of these prominent peoples is Sheikh Sufi, who also attempted a similar thing. What was Dara like when he was playing the role of a governor of provinces? And mind you, he was made the governor of several provinces, such as Allahabad, Punjab, Multan, and later on he was also given the governorship of Bihar. He was always ruling these long settled and rich provinces of the Mughal Empire. He never had to deal with the more problematic provinces, something like Deccan, maybe, where Aurangzeb was very frequently sent. And Dara, because he was ruling at these easier provinces, had also the chance to not be physically present in those provinces himself. He could spend his time at the court by the side of his father, the Emperor Shah Jahan, and he was ruling mostly through deputies. He had employed them to be his representatives, and he would direct the matters through them. So he never administered these provinces directly. So, like I said, that all the provinces that he was given to rule were the sort of easier provinces, you can say that. Because rebellions and political strife was less likely in those provinces, because these were annexed to the Mughal Empire long time back in the history of the dynasty, the Mughal dynasty. And these were also very fertile regions, almost the central part of the northern India, like as we call it in Indic terms, Aryavarta, Punjab, and also modern day UP, Haryana. These areas were under the governorship of Dara, and these were very fertile, rich regions. How was Dara like when he played the role of a military commander? That is also a question that we can ask, and we should ask. So the interesting thing to note here is that it was only once in his life that Dara was sent to conduct a military campaign, and this was during the third siege of Kandahar. And there are also very disheartening accounts of how Dara conducted himself in the camp when he was leading this campaign. But we will come to that later on. What happened due to his absence from all these campaigns, which were led by mostly by his brothers and also other officers who were made into generals, commanders of the army, to take care of the troubles which were brewing at different provinces or at the borders. What happened through that is that Dara lost touch with the active army. He never got to lead the campaign with a real army apart from that one time, and even there his records are not very hopeful. So he had practically no experience in the art of war, and he was also made unfit for the bloody war of succession as a result of his loss of touch with the active army and his inexperience at leading campaigns. What sort of influence did Dara exert on the people present at the court? Immense. Unlike his brothers, he was never sent to these provinces which were given to him to govern, and he also got a lot of time actually, because he did not have to spend his days commanding a campaign. So most of his life he remained at the court by the side of his father, the emperor. And he grew a taste for flattery. What happens with these cases usually is that people try to serve their own interests, people at the court, by simply flattering an influential person. And they were no fools. They could see that the aging emperor was heavily dependent on this son of his, Darashiko, and Darashiko became a sort of mediator between the emperor and all these people at the court. But this sort of influence was only nominal because there was no real experience backing Dara through which he could derive this power, this influence. It was only at his father's name. He was ruling, or rather, he was indirectly managing all these people at the court by his father's name. And, so it was a deadly combination for Dara, or for anybody for that matter, who is supposed to become the empire, the ruler of an entire empire, a vast empire like India. Father's favor and the flattery of the courtiers. These two things are not good for somebody who's looking to be the emperor himself. Looking at Dara's character, if we look at the evaluations from different historiographical accounts, this one is from Sir Jodunath Sarkar, and I quote, Aurangzeb in later life spoke of Dara as a proud, insolent to the nobles and ungovernable in temper and speech. But you can, very legitimately ask that Aurangzeb was Dara's mortal enemy, and therefore why should we depend on a testimony of this sort, which comes from Aurangzeb? So you can also look at the testimony from other people, and especially, good men, people who were considered to be loyal officers to the throne. And this particular quote helps you understand that. I quote, the detailed account of his siege of Kandahar when Dara was sent to this campaign of Kandahar, written by an admirer. This particular person who's writing this account was really an admirer of Dara and was very loyal to the throne, to the emperor. The detailed account of his siege of Kandahar, written by an admirer, shows him in the odious light of an incompetent braggart, almost insane with conceit, capricious and childish in the management of affairs. So he likes flattery, and he likes to naturally boast about his non-existent powers and glory. So this is the kind of picture that we get of Darashiko as a person, as a military commander, as a leader. And, if you look at the times of crisis, then Dara's character comes out even more vividly, because then we get to see the kind of reactions Dara had, the kind of actions Dara took in order to deal with the exigencies of those serious problems at his hand. And that sort of situation arose with the aging emperor Shah Jahan falling ill. He fell seriously ill sometime in the later part of 1657, as I was saying. And here is a quote from Supriya Gandhi's work. I quote it in full. In an attempt to quell hearsay and speculation about the emperor's possible death, Dara blocked most courtiers from all access to the emperor or his news, also detaining his brother's agents at court. Dara ordered for Mir Abu al-Hassan, Shuja's representative, one of the representatives of his brothers, to be shackled and pilloried, and even threatened to rend the man's limbs. Such acts, Gandhi goes on to say, planted in the kingdom's soil the seed of fasad, a word connoting corruption, sedition, and chaos, a threat to the state and to order. So, Sophia Gandhi has translated and quoted some accounts written by people who had experienced that particular time of Shah Jahan's illness and the problem that arose in the wake of it. I think this particular account is from somebody called Masu. So this is the kind of action that completely berserk. He had gone completely berserk, and he was at his wits' end, and therefore he was taking these rash actions, stopping courtiers to from visiting the emperor, and stopping his brother's agents from gaining news of the emperor's health, which easily, which easily created the impression that the emperor was perhaps dead, and therefore Darashiko was ruling in his name, in his stead, and he did not want that news to spill out. He was simply taking his time, biding his time to prepare the situation for his ascendance to the throne. This one also is very, telling of Dara's character. Again, from History of Aurangzeb, Volume 1, written by Sir Jadunath Sarkar. And I quote this: Dara was a loving husband, a doting father, and a devoted son, all those things that are of historical interest. But as a ruler of men in troubled times, he must have been a failure. Long continued prosperity had unnerved his character and made him incapable of planning wisely, daring boldly, and achieving strenuously, or if need were, of wresting victory from the jaws of defeat by desperate effort or heroic endurance. The darling of the court was utterly out of his element in the camp. The center of a circle of flattering nobles and ministers knew not how to make a number of generals obey one's masterly will, and act in harmony and concert. Military organization and tactical combination were beyond his power, beyond Dara's power. And he had never learned by practice how to guide the varying tides of a battle with the coolness and judgment of a true general. This novice in the art of war was destined to meet a practiced veteran as his rival for the throne, which he did in the in the person of in the person of Aurangzeb. This is what Dara is like during the war of succession between the brothers. His history during the war of succession clearly proves that with all the wealth and influence that he had come to exert through the years, due to the favors bestowed on him by his caring father, he could secure very few devoted followers or efficient lieutenants when the real need for them actually came during this war of successions. And the people who were self-seeking, who were working to fulfill their own interests, the mercenary of the army and the court, must have recognized that in following him against the astute and experienced Aurangzeb, they would be only backing a losing side. So these observations are made by Sir Jadunath Sarkar, but these are dependent on certain facts, which I will try to present. So Dara had apparently gained a lot of influence because his father was particularly kind to him. He had given him a very high rank and the commandership of 50,000 horses and titles. But all of those things came to nothing because he lacked experience in the practical day-to-day business of rulership, of administration, and so on. So this is the actual worth of the influence that he seemed to have gained over the nobles at the court. He was firstly no judge of character, and this is evident from several instances, some of which are also recorded by foreign travelers like Francois Bernier. a French traveler. Men of ability and self-respect must have kept away from a person like Dara, who was a vain person, always boasting about his non-existent glory, and also as a master who was injudicious. And therefore, no one was willing to back this losing side in the War of Succession. No one was ready to back Dara Shikoh. And he also, experienced some failed missions represented by the wrong people. He sent the wrong people as emissaries to conduct certain missions, and those failed pathetically. And Dara's image among his brothers and the nobility, as you can understand, are strewn by words like foolish and idiot without reason, God forsaken, apostate. All the pejorative ideas that people can garner from the conduct of such a people. And this is exactly what his brothers and other people at the court thought about him. Now we come to this question of what if, and the kind of perils that are involved in engaging oneself with such a lingering question. This is really about romanticizing the possibility of Dara's victory in the War of Succession. So what would have happened if Dara had won the War of Succession, and instead of Aurangzeb, if he had become Hindustan? So the first question that we should ask while dealing with such a hypothetical question is whether Dara actually had any kind of vision for India, the territories that he was about to rule. Did he have any vision for that? Dara had only a very clear vision about how his personal brand would look like. And he depended only on popularity and image. He was the darling of the people at the court. They flattered him. And also, some sections of the common people really loved him because of his mediation between them, their complaints, and the emperor. But he certainly lacked a political vision for ruling a vast country like India. And following his grandfather and great-grandfather, he attempted to present himself as a divine sovereign. Okay, this was a pet project of Dara Shikoh, and this was also connected to building his image as somebody who would be seen as a legitimate ruler, somebody like Jahangir or Akbar. And Dara Shikoh completely lacked any administrative skill and political vision, which is why he had no real capacity to rule over his diverse subjects in a vast country like India. The only scenario, if we go on to consider this hypothesis further, we will see that the only scenario in which Dara would have succeeded in the War of Succession is the absence of any rival brother, any rival possible male heir. In that case, Dara might have had rule for a few years, maybe a few decades, but with a very, very palpable, great possibility of mutiny or coup d'etat, or by the nobility, or even invasion by foreign powers. So these were very distinct and real possibilities if Dara had become the king after winning the War of Succession with his brothers. Of course, literature and arts might have flourished for a few more decades before the eventual fall of Mughals. Why I say eventual fall of Mughals? Because of the great possibility of the mutiny or coup d'etat or the invasion, and also because of this very important last fact, the religious orthodoxy was looking for a face in the Mughal court because of Dara's coquetry with Hindu thought. They were trying to find out a face from among the four brothers, who would become a face of the holy wars that might have become possible or necessary. So, which it would have eventually found in somebody or the other. Even if Dara had no other male rivals, if he had no brothers, he had Roshanara, the sister, who backed Aurangzeb, and the mere existence of such relatives would have been easier for somebody from the family to be propped up as the face of the religious orthodoxy. And it would have eventually come to a strife, a bloody conflict. So I will end this talk with the sources that I have used, the primary and secondary sources, mainly through translations for the primary sources. So, firstly, by Supriya Gandhi, there's this very important book called The Emperor Who Never Was. This was very recently published. Another one, very important reference, is by Sir Jagnath Sarkar, History of Aurangzeb. In this case, I have referred to the first volume, and a biography of Dara Shikoh, a well-referenced one, written with a flair for literary style, called Dara Shikoh, The Man Who Would Be King. Also, I have depended on the descriptions found in Bernier's account, The Death of Dara Shikoh, and also some translations of Dara's own works, Majmu' al-Bahrain, or the confluence of the two seas, by which he means Islam and Hinduism, purportedly, and also Dara's work, Safinatul Awliya.
What would have been had Dara Shikoh actually managed to, suppose there wasn't an Aurangzeb or something happened and people conspired against Aurangzeb, and Dara Shikoh indeed did become the emperor of Hindustan. Do you think the way he managed, and like as you've rightly shown, he just wasn't a commander or an administrator or anything, that the Mughal Empire would have perhaps fallen apart sooner and the Marathas would have gained a foothold, so we would have actually had a strong Hindu empire sooner? Second is, perhaps would it be fair to say that given what he was doing, trying to sort of, syncretize Islam and Hinduism, which we were all taught is like a very good thing, but would it be fair to say that there would perhaps have been more conversions of Hindus to Islam? So these are the two what ifs. Would we have had, the collapse of the Mughal Empire sooner? And two, would we have had more conversions had he come on board actually than what we are, led to believe otherwise? Thank you.
It is perhaps difficult to speculate what would have been the alternative in terms of the powers that sought to fill the vacuum at the center, whether it would be the Marathas or the Sikhs, or maybe even the other power, the foreign power of the British, which was also fast becoming relevant for the Indian scenario. That is difficult for me to speculate, but like I was trying to engage with this question of what if Dara Shikoh had no male rivals, if there were no Aurangzeb, Shuja, Murad, what would have happened? And my feeling is that the Mughal dynasty would have fallen apart in a few decades anyway, because the troubles that led to the factors rather that led to this war of succession, which is more or less like a very repetitive trope for the Mughal dynasty, because of the absence of primogeniture, the practice of primogeniture among them. But specifically for the case of Dara and his brothers, there was this feeling among the Islamic orthodoxy present at the court that there is nobody to back the vision of the orthodoxy. And therefore, they had a great anxiety as to who would be their leader. And so, somebody or the other would have been propped up by some relative close or distant of Dara Shikoh. For example, I will again cite the case of Roshan Ara, a sister of Dara Shikoh, who backed Aurangzeb and who hated Dara's guts and all those things that Dara stood for. And therefore, somebody would have surely been propped up by a member of the family. And a feud would have inevitably ensued, and eventually the thing would fall apart. Now, coming to the second question, I think it's very interesting, and I'm glad that you raised it. My feeling is that you can look upon Dara Shikoh as some sort of a second avatar of a reincarnation of Akbar. And as a result of Akbar's sort of policies towards Hindus and also Christians, other religions basically, but most prominently towards Hindus, was that a lot of Rajput chiefs, Rajput kings had become soft towards the Mughal dynasty. And this procedure would have continued if Dara Shikoh had come to power. And this would have perhaps been applied in other areas of the empire, maybe in the northeast and also in the Deccan, and that would have been, a cause for bringing more and more provinces within the governorship of some or the other Muslim ruler, if not of a Mughal ruler specifically. So this is what I have to say.
Thank you for an informative and actually thought-provoking lecture. So there are some questions that arise. First of all, in one of your slides, you had characterized Jahangir as you had said that Dara Shikoh had tendency towards asceticism, and in which he resembled Jahangir. But as far as I remember, Jahangir was not too deep into religion or anything like that, because he was more into substance abuse, if I remember correctly. And the other question is, how was Dara perceived as by the Hindus? Because you know that Rajput forces were the mainstay of the Mughal Empire, and it's rather surprising that they all opted for the Puritan Aurangzeb, whose ideas on religion were pretty clear by that time. These are the kinds of questions that arose in my mind when you were talking about all these things. So if you could throw some light on them.
Sure, I'll try. Thank you for these questions. Firstly, about Jahangir, when I said that he was trying to get at this creation of an image for a divine sovereign, it can be done in many ways. You don't have to project yourself as somebody who is a very religious person. Although there are recorded accounts of Jahangir making numerous visits to the Ajmer Sharif Dargah, the Dargah of Sufi Saint Muinuddin Chishti, right? And also Akbar, it may be interesting for you to think about. Just like Akbar, Jahangir had also made a public statement of abstaining from animal flesh. So these are the kind of things that Jahangir projected to the public in order to create that sort of a divine sovereign kind of image for himself. And Dara took after these two. And your second question was about what was the perception of Dara among the Hindus, especially the Rajput. So when I was referring to the nobility present at the imperial court, you have to consider that this nobility is, represented by both Hindus and Muslims. And there was most prominently the Raja Jai Singh, who was a very trusted commander of the armies. He had at his disposal some 20,000 horses, which is a very high-ranking officer's prerogative, if I'm not wrong. So Jai Singh was trusted by both Dara and the Emperor Shah Jahan. They had sent Jai Singh to quell the rebellion by Shuja in the Bengal province. And Jai Singh was a very shrewd man. He could very easily see through the weaknesses of Dara Shikoh, and he bided his time. He did not immediately act upon the orders from the imperial court, even though Dara Shikoh had repeatedly requested him to immediately go and aid his son, Suleiman Shikoh, I think, to go and quell the rebellion by Shuja. So if you look at the other courtiers, they were all very, very skeptical about Dara Shikoh's possibility of becoming the eventual emperor of the empire. Jai Singh had considerable influence among them, especially among the Hindu courtiers. So you can gain some sort of an idea from the skeptical attitude that Jai Singh bore towards Dara Shikoh and his possibilities of actually becoming an emperor through this.
मेरा एक सवाल है कि भारत ने खोज जो सीरियल DD1 पर आती थी उसमें इस पर पूरा एक दिखाया गया था और उसमें इसको काफी कायर के तौर पर चीज दिखाया गया था, ट्रिब्यूट के तौर पर कि एक बार उन्होंने मैंने अपना राज्य छोड़ करके भाग गए थे। उसमें एक बार भी दिखाया गया था कि औरंगजेब को हत्या करने की मतलब प्लानिंग थी, फिर उसको औरंगजेब को पता चल गया था। तो अच्छा, उसके बाद एक तो इस पर थोड़ा प्रकाश डाल दीजिए और दूसरा है कि जजिया कर जो था कि अगर मतलब ये जो मतलब ये थे मतलब दारा सिकोह रहते तो क्या मतलब इट विल कंटिन्यू, पहली बात। और दारा सिकोह रहते तो दारा सिकोह के बारे में कहा जाता है कि एकदम फियरफुल नहीं थे, तो क्या हिंदुओं का शासन थोड़ा जल्दी आता या फिर क्या होता, इस पर अगर कुछ लाइट डालते तो थोड़ा ज्यादा सहूलियत हो।
Thank you for these questions, and it is perhaps interesting to look at the popular depictions of Dara Shikoh. That itself can be a topic of a lecture, and we can dwell at that particular thing at some length. You have mentioned Bharat Ek Khoj, but I also can mention the case of Upanishad Ganga, series, the TV series, which was produced by the Chinmaya Mission, and it was serially produced during 2011-12, those years, or maybe between 2012 and 13, something like that. So in most of these depictions, Dara is shown as all those other factors that I have not talked about. Firstly, Dara as a devoted son, Dara as a pious man, Dara as a champion of the arts and philosophies, mysticism, theology, and so on. But whenever Dara is shown as somebody who's conspiring at the murder of one of his brothers, or trying to quell the rebellions of the three brothers, that is not at all wrong. So, as you can understand, he is located in Agra. He is only moving between Shahjahanabad, Delhi, and Agra. So, he is located at a central location of the empire, and all his brothers are advancing on the capital from the three sides of the Indian subcontinent. Shuja was advancing from Bengal, Aurangzeb was advancing from the Deccan, and there was Murad from Gujarat. So there was considerable pressure on Dara, and therefore he tried everything that he could do in order to quell these rebellions, and he tried conspiracies. He tried to dissuade his brothers by giving them false news. Firstly, he tried, there's a very interesting incident that happened with Aurangzeb. So there was this person called Isa Beg, who was an agent of Aurangzeb. And because all these three brothers, Aurangzeb, Murad, and Shuja, they were far removed from the capital because they were either governing the distant provinces or they were leading some campaign or the other. For example, Aurangzeb was mostly busy with the campaigns at southern region of the country, in Deccan, dealing with the Marathas and Bijapur and Golconda, all these places. So these brothers had their agents at the court from whom they used to get news of the capital, but mostly about the well-being and health of emperor, their father. And whenever there would be some inkling of the emperor falling ill, then at least Murad and Aurangzeb, who bitterly hated Dara. They were very, very resentful from their childhood, and also by the sister Roshan. They would advance towards the capital to capture it. So Isa Beg was one such agent of Aurangzeb, and this person was firstly stopped by Dara from visiting the emperor and getting first-hand news and sending them, which was a very bad mistake, very bad move, in my opinion, because that immediately arises suspicion in the mind of not just the brothers, but also among other courtiers present at the imperial court. And news started to spread fast in the capital and then also through the other provinces that the emperor must have been dead. And even when, some letters were sent through other means, some correspondence were held between the emperor and one of these three brothers, and most importantly with Aurangzeb. They would simply not take these letters seriously. They would just say that it must have been the case that the emperor is now an invalid and Dara Shikoh is controlling him. So Isa Beg was, by Dara, Dara's foolish act was to send Isa Beg to Aurangzeb and give some sort of, signal for a treaty. And this move backfired because Isa Beg went to Aurangzeb and simply told him that now the emperor is so weak that he cannot control the affairs of the empire, and it is Dara who has become the de facto emperor. And very naturally, Aurangzeb was enraged, and he found his resolve to attack the capital redoubled. So there is nothing wrong in the depiction of Dara Shikoh conspiring something, because that would be very natural for him to do that. And what was the other question? I think, about jizya tax. So I must say that I have not particularly looked at the taxing policy, but as far as I'm aware, Dara Shikoh had actually been quite kind to certain sections of the common people, and especially the peasants from the Punjab and Western UP region, because there are recorded instances where certain feudal lords in those areas had been exacting more taxes than they should have. And there were representations from the peasants to the imperial court, and Dara, who was the mediator of such things, had interacted with them, and he had actually, made the emperor let go of all those taxes, and he also made sure that the feudal lords who were exacting more taxes than were necessary are punished. So that sort of information is what I presently have, but I cannot throw more light on the jizya tax as far as Dara Shikoh's reign is concerned, or his de facto reign is concerned. But the translations were not so much his own as they were commissioned by him, because he Allahabad and the regions in and around Banaras, so he had access to all the renowned Hindu Pandits, the Brahmins, who were the scholars of Vedanta and so on, and he had employed them in order to do these translations. And also this will be interesting to note here that he had in his employment somebody called Chandrabhan, who was knower of Persian and Sanskrit, both these languages. So he might have some knowledge of Sanskrit, but it will perhaps be an exaggeration to say that the translations were done by Dara Shikoh himself. Although we can say that he took the initiative, and these translations came into existence because of him, and he led the whole project.
Someone said that his work towards
translating our book is noble. I don't think so. Someone stealing your knowledge, someone actually translating it and using it for their good use cannot be called that it was a religious work. My question is that from what little I have read, there is two distinct things that I have read. One is that Dara Shikoh was a religious fanatic and needed the military might to actually further his cause. Aurangzeb, on the other hand, had the military might and later used the religion to actually further his vision. So if you look at this part, it is almost like choosing between, if you talk about past, that would you rather be bitten by a cobra or would you want to be killed by a python? So in either ways, we were any which way going to be massacred as we have been. So now here the point is that, do you think that the lesson for the Hindus is stop glorifying one brother because you hate the other one and look at the history from every perspective? Just because Dara Shikoh read the books, translated the books, does not mean he's a good guy. He's not. His record does not speak so. Do you think that should be the lesson? At least that's the lesson from me from this talk.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a very interesting way to put it, and a little too polemical, if I might say so. But firstly, talking about the translations that he had commissioned and the kind of a project he had undertaken, and what could have been, if any, the ultimate or ulterior even motives that he had in getting those texts translated. One cannot know for sure, but this is something that I have alluded to during my talk towards the beginning, that Dara Shikoh was a devout Muslim, first and foremost. And he was trying to find the resonance of the very distinctly Islamic concept of monotheism, which is Tawhid, in the other religions of the world. So it is not so much of trying to get at the truth of other religions, but rather finding the truth of one's own religion reflected, echoed in the other religions. So he was sort of trying to seek validation, you might say, of Islam, or rather, more specifically, the Islamic idea of Tawhid in the other religions. That, I think, might be a better way of putting it. And what was the other question? I think about writing of history. So, I alluded to this when I was engaging with the question of what if. So there is a distinct danger in romanticizing these possibilities, especially when you have the distinct experience of not finding out, not deriving any real good in terms of your self-expression and finding your self-confidence as a nation through the long reigns of people like Akbar and Jahangir and Shah Jahan. Mind you, each of these three great Mughals, Akbar, Shah Jahan, and Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan, they were constantly fighting the Rajput kings. And it was only at the time of Shah Jahan, or not exactly at the time of Shah Jahan, but rather at the time of Jahangir. It was Khurram. Shah Jahan did not become Shah Jahan at that time. He was simply Khurram, one of the sons of Jahangir, who had defeated Rana Amar Singh. And that was a very, very important victory for the Mughals. Because with that, the annexation of almost the whole of Rajputana was made possible for the Mughals. In terms of what sort of cultural good that has done to the nation as a whole, hardly any. So if you ask this question, and I think it is very important to ask it by anybody who's thinking of writing histories or engaging with history, what is the reason, or what are the chief goals with which we write history? What is the purpose of historiography, so to speak? So I believe that the purpose of historiography is to get at the truth of one's self-consciousness as a nation. When you are, as an Indian or as a Hindu or as an Indic person, you're trying to find your own voice. You're trying to find your freedom in expressing yourself in the cultural sphere. When you're trying to break the shackles of cultural dominance by foreign powers or inimical forces, then you try to narrate your own history and you try to build your own identity through that particular action of writing history. And if that purpose is not served, then there is hardly any value that can be derived through the act of writing history or historiography. So if we are engaging with the history of Dara Shikoh or any of the Mughals, then we have to constantly keep asking ourselves, what purpose is it serving in order to find our own voice and getting at our own identity, expressing our self-consciousness as well as self-confidence? Is it giving us self-confidence, or is it actually harming our self-confidence? So if we can keep these two considerations in mind when we are engaging with history or when we are trying to write history, self-confidence and self-expression as a nation or as a representative of the national consciousness, then I think the purpose of writing history will be served. Hope that helps. It is a fact that Dara Shikoh was not, somebody who was hated by the people. Okay, so he enjoyed quite a bit of influence among certain sections. For example, the case of the peasants, which I cited, he had mediated between these peasants and the emperor. He had done exactly what these peasants were demanding from him, from the emperor. So it is quite possible that when he was in dire straits, when he was publicly paraded on the streets of Delhi, feel grief and people would be protesting. And in fact, there are descriptions from, I think, the accounts of Vanier, or maybe the Vanier, I cannot recall the exact account in this case, but there are such accounts where it is described that the public, people who have gathered on both sides of the streets are protesting. They are unhappy at the sight of Dara Shikoh and his child being paraded. But perhaps it will be pertinent to ask the question, what are the factors which brought Dara Shikoh and his family to such dire straits? And that is what I was engaging with, really.
There is a comment by the Panjri ji that Akbar was not as great as he was made out to be, and he had destroyed temples. He was a Kattar Muslim for the longest time, and he turned more towards Jainism later in life. So if you'd like to remark on that.
Whether he actually did all these things and he engaged with Jainism. Yeah, there are accounts of Akbar destroying temples, of course, but I cannot really verify whether he turned towards Jainism. My idea is that he tried to evolve a theology of his own, which he did not really name. He did not give any distinct name to it. The name Dini Ilahi that is attached to this particular theology was actually a work of the courtiers in Akbar's court. So it was post Akbar's conception of this theology. Yes, but I'm not sure whether he specifically engaged with the ideas of Jain theology or Jain philosophy, for that matter. I cannot.
Thank you for allowing me. My comment was because I think one of the questions was with regard to how Akbar was a good king and so on, as we've been taught. And it's only the last some years that even I've gotten to know so much about what Akbar really did and how it's all just been sort of airbrushed by history. I'm more, in keeping with Jasodari's comment, that we should really not romanticize the Mughal kings too much, because they had an agenda very clearly and they were following what they had to. So Dara Shikoh is a little bit of an interesting, maybe an outlier kind of character. And just Sridharji, going back to what you were describing about him, he's somehow, for some reason I was amused, reminded me a little bit about Rahul Gandhi. I mean, generally entitlement hai, sab hai. He wants to do good. He says he wants to do good, but we don't know. That was what I had intended with the Akbar comment. That just to point out that not to, so that we don't get into this, he was a good guy. That's all.
I mean, the only comment that I will make in this regard is that maybe you and others, we all should engage with that particular period in Dara Shikoh's life when he was aged between 30 and 42. And this is the time when he spent his life with his father, by the side of his father, and the kind of lavish income that his father had thrown at him, the high ranks that were given to him, and also the influence that was given to him by attaching 50,000 horses and so on. All these things are, they make for a good parallel, I think. That's all I would say.
Hi, Sridharji. So my question is a little sidetracked, I should say, but I'll make it quick. I mean, it's apparent from your talk that, Hindu Rajputs had definitely a very high position in the Mughal court, even during the time of Aurangzeb, during the time of Shah Jahan and so on. And Mirza Raja Jai Singh was the most prominent person with respect to that. So in your studies, have you come across, the restrictions that were imposed upon Hindus in the court of Aurangzeb or Shah Jahan? Like, for example, should they wear a tika or should they not wear a tika or something like that? The reason why I ask this question is, the recently released movie Tanhaji, in which the depiction of Rajputs like Uday Bhan and Jai Singh was more Islamic than Hindu. So though it is obvious that Bollywood it kind of does a black and white depiction, exaggerated depictions of the good and the evil or whatever. But then with respect to this, I'd just like to know from you, how Hindu were the Rajputs who served in the court of the Mughals?
So Jai Singh himself was quite a bit of a liberal, in the sense that there are accounts where we get to see Jai Singh sharing food with one of the members of the Muslim nobility. And at his time, in the mid 17th century, it would be something of an outrage for an Hindu man or anybody who is from a noble Hindu family to be sharing food with a Muslim. So it is something like marriage. That was a taboo. So this taboo was no taboo for Jai Singh, at least. That is clear. So this is the only thing that I have come across while studying, the times of Dara Shikoh and Aurangzeb. But whether they were allowed to wear or display the signs of their Hinduness, wearing tika, etc., I cannot really throw much light on that. But there is this particular account where I don't know what motivated Jai Singh to do so. Whether he was of that sort of disposition, whether he had a personality which was more liberal, or whether he was trying to appease the person who met him, because he had the motive of judging, testing the waters of the times of Dara Shikoh. He could not really trust this man, who he knew to be utterly incompetent as far as rulership is concerned, and therefore he was testing the waters while interacting with different people who were being sent to him from Shuja, and this particular person from with who he shared his food, he came from Shuja, the governor in Bengal. So there might be motivations in the mind of Jai Singh to appease certain persons at certain occasions. So whether he was predisposed to liberal behavior himself, I cannot really make an informed comment on that. But there we have this account with us.